In the showroom of a Solingen blade factory, rows of swords, rapiers, and sabers hang on the walls and lie across tables. A rich, carefully finished catalog of what this town has built its name on for 600 years. What Germans call blanke Waffen, edged weapons, cover exactly these three types: Schwerter, Degen, and Säbel. This film follows both halves of how a blade like this gets made. The handcraft still practiced today, largely as home industry scattered through workshops around the town, and the modern industrial refinement carried out inside the factories themselves. The camera lingers first on the display itself, a single ornate sword hilt resting on a table, then a slow pan across an entire wall hung floor to ceiling with finished blades, each one catching the light a little differently. The raw material, by contrast, starts as nothing decorative at all, plain steel bar stock bought in from steel dealers. At the power hammer, a smith in a striped work shirt guides each rod under the machine, and the metal glows a deep orange red as the hammer strikes down on it again and again, rotated by hand between blows so the shape builds evenly on every side. This is the first of 4 separate passes the bladesmith makes on every piece. The very first pass forges the tang, the narrow stem at the base of the blade that will later be driven into the grip by the sword fitter, the craftsman who assembles the finished weapon. Rod after rod goes under the hammer this way, glowing hot, worked, cooling to gray steel as the shape sets, until a whole pile of forged rods lies waiting on the workshop floor for the next stage. Between each forging pass, the rough blanks go back into the glowing furnace to reheat. Without that heat, the steel simply won't move under the hammer. The next pass draws the blade out, lengthening it toward its final size. Solingen's own documented history with this trade stretches back further than most. The earliest written evidence of edged weapons being made here dates to the 14th century. For all that time, the craft has traditionally been split among 4 separate trade groups, each with its own guild and its own skill: the smith, the hardener, the grinder, and the sword fitter. Under the power hammer, it's the smith's job to give the raw iron not just its shape, but its strength and, just as important, its elasticity. A blade that can't flex is a blade that will eventually snap. One more forging step follows before the blade leaves the smith's hands, hammering in the hollow groove, known colloquially and rather dramatically as the blood groove. The name is folklore, not function. What the hollow actually does is reduce the blade's weight without costing it any structural stability. A groove worked directly into hot steel rather than cut afterward. Hand forging like this survives, but for industrial mass production, it has largely been mechanized, as seen here at the Klingenfabrik Hörster, where blanks are heated in the furnace to 1200 degrees Celsius, then fed directly into a rolling machine that does the shaping work a hammer once did by hand. Before every single pass through the rollers, a worker oils the machine, a small maintenance ritual repeated hundreds of times a day. Back at the smithy, Herr Paffenhof, 58 years old, runs his own forge out of a workshop he built himself. A trained free-form smith by background, he specialized in edged weapon forging in 1972 and has stayed with it ever since. Each year, he hand forges roughly 6,000 blades for Solingen's blade factories and for customers both in Germany and abroad. One man, at one hammer, supplying a meaningful share of a whole industry. He works bareheaded in a cap, ear protection clamped over his ears against the constant noise of the hammer, his face set in concentration with every strike. On the straightening form of the anvil, he turns and reworks the tip of each blade, sighting along the steel, making small precision strikes, checking the curve, adjusting, striking again until the profile satisfies him. Then lifts the finished piece away with tongs and sets it aside for the next stage. From the smithy, the forged blades move next door into the hardening shop, a separate room built right beside the forge. Here works Herr Lange, 23 years old, a trained tool maker who took a job with Paffenhof as a hardener rather than staying in his original trade. Hardening happens in a glow furnace at a temperature of roughly 890 degrees Celsius. From there, the blade goes straight into a quenching bath, Oil, in this case, though water serves the same purpose in other shops, and the sudden drop in temperature locks the steel into a harder, tighter internal structure than it had before. The goal isn't uniform hardness throughout, though. The surface of the blade needs to reach real hardness, the kind that will hold an edge, but the core has to stay tough and somewhat ductile, or the whole blade becomes brittle and prone to snapping under stress rather than flexing. It's a balance the hardener controls with heat and timing, not with any single fixed recipe. A younger worker in a blue shirt loads a row of blades into the furnace and slides the door shut. When a blade is ready, he pulls it out glowing red and plunges it straight into the oil quench, which erupts in thick smoke before the smoke finally clears. He lifts the rack out, rests it on the tank edge to drain, and carries it to a second tank. Once quenched, each blade goes into that second tank, a degreasing bath, a chemical rinse that strips away the scale and residue left behind by hardening, a necessary cleaning step before the steel moves on. After hardening comes tempering, reheating the blade in a separate tempering oven, this time to a much gentler 200 degrees Celsius or so. The hardening process leaves steel hard but brittle. Tempering brings back the flexibility and elasticity a working blade actually needs, trading a small amount of that raw hardness for a blade that won't shatter on impact. Hardening also tends to warp a blade slightly, and that warp has to be corrected before the piece can go any further. This is straightening, sighting down the length of the blade, tapping it back true with careful, targeted hammer strikes on the anvil. The man doing this work here is Herr Lange Sr., 56 years old and, like his younger colleague, a trained toolmaker who found his way into the swordsmithy rather than a conventional machine shop. The grinding shop is its own world entirely, and it comes with its own occupational hazards. At the first grinding station, what's known simply as the Big Stone, the sword grinder works sitting close to a large, constantly wet grinding wheel and dresses for it accordingly. Wooden clogs on his feet, heavy tarpaulins and covers draped around his legs, and knee protection against the damp that seeps up from the floor and the cold that rises with it. Wet grinding is hard on the body in ways that build up slowly. The constant moisture is known to bring on rheumatic complaints over years of exposure. Far more serious, historically, was grinding on natural stone, which threw fine mineral dust into the air and caused silicosis, a scarring lung disease that ended many grinders' careers early, sometimes their lives. Synthetic grinding stones are mandatory today specifically because they don't carry that same risk. Before any blade touches the wheel, the stone itself needs attention. The grinder dresses the face of the wheel with a tool called the ritzer, scoring it to keep the cutting surface true and even. The blade is then set into a rest, the ortsporn, that supports and guides it against the stone. Between the blade and the spinning wheel sit small wooden blocks that the grinder holds and repositions constantly. Because they inevitably brush the stone themselves, even carefully, they wear down fast. A grinder goes through a fresh set roughly every 4 to 6 weeks. After grinding, there shouldn't be a single bump left on the blade. That's the standard Willi Ulrich, the sword grinder, holds himself to, and it isn't a figure of speech. Achieving it takes a trained eye and, just as much, a trained feel for the steel, knowing by touch alone whether a blade is running perfectly even along its whole length, without a single low or high spot breaking the line. In a second workshop room, the blade surfaces get worked further across a whole sequence of different grinding stones and buffing wheels, each suited to a particular stage of the finish. Before starting the dry wheel, the grinder flips the switch and watches it spin up to speed, then pulls on a pair of thick leather gloves and settles onto the bench with a protective rag laid across his lap. He reaches for a blade, presses it to the spinning wheel, and sparks shower off the steel in a bright arc, funneled away by a metal collector mounted just above the wheel. Rough grinding of the spine and the cutting edge happens this way, on a fine-grained stone. Fine relative to the coarse first-pass stone, though still aggressive enough to remove real material and establish the blade's final profile before the finer polishing stages take over. Some grinding stones aren't flat at all. They're shaped, their surface ground into a matching profile that will cut the hollow groove into the blade rather than a flat face. This is form grinding, and it takes as much preparation on the stone itself as it does on the blade. On the thin, shaped wheel built for this cut, Ulrich slides the blade vertically along its length, sparks pouring off as the groove cuts deeper. He checks the groove just cut before setting the blade with the others. The man doing this work, Willi Ulrich, is 53 and learned the trade starting in 1956. Grinding has run in his family for a documented 400 years. Not a round figure, an actual traceable lineage of grinders stretching back through generations of the same family, in the same town, at the same trade. After finishing his apprenticeship and his years as a journeyman, Ulrich went independent in 1966, setting up as a home worker, grinding blades on contract rather than as a factory employee. He worked at the time for the 4 Solingen blade factories that had survived the war. As a contract grinder, Ulrich ground between 1 and 2,000 saber blades a month, the specialty he'd built his reputation on. His clients, through the factories he worked for, read like a list of who still carried edged weapons at all in the 20th century. The royal houses of Europe, military customers across South America, and various African states. In those years, Solingen held the entire world market for this kind of work more or less alone. That's shifted since. Low-wage producers, Pakistan among them, have entered a market Solingen once had entirely to itself. Since 1985, Ulrich has also built complete sabers from scratch, rather than just grinding blades for others to assemble. Work he supplies mainly to student dueling fraternities and to carnival associations, 2 of the few customer bases in modern Germany that still actually use a sword for something. Pleiston is the term for the next stage, fine grinding the blade surfaces smooth on a grinding belt, well past the rough shaping of the earlier stones. Overhead, a system of sealing pipes draws the dust away as he works. Wearing a dust mask against the fine grit, he pulls the blade across the abrasive belt again and again, flipping it to work the other side. Before the final polish, he picks up a solid block of polishing paste and presses it against a spinning felt wheel, loading the wheel with compound, then works the blade against a sisal brush wheel until the surface takes on real shine. Holding the hot steel with a cloth as he finishes the polish, then pulling it away to check the shine before setting it on the rack with the others. The film cuts to a brick factory building marked simply WKC, one of Solingen's blade factories, where the finished blades from the grinding shop travel next for a different kind of surface work entirely. Damascening. Decorating the steel with ornamental patterns, not through the wood grain folding process the word sometimes implies elsewhere, but through a printing technique unique to Solingen. The man carrying out that work here, in a gray lab coat at his own printing bench, is Herr Lange, 56, and one of the few damasceners left who still practices the traditional method by hand, start to finish. It begins with a metal printing plate engraved with whatever pattern the finished blade is meant to carry. Hamzat dips a tool into a pot of thick black asphalt lacquer and spreads it over the engraved plate, working it into the lines, then scrapes the excess back off the flat surfaces with a tool called a Z-Klinge, a draw blade, pulling it firmly down the plate until only the engraved pattern itself holds any lacquer. What's left behind on the plate, in stark black against bare metal, is an ornate, intricate design that will eventually appear on the blade itself. Next, he lays a sheet of water-soluble tissue paper over the inked plate and runs it through a hand-cranked damascening press, an old-fashioned printing press, cranked by hand rather than run by motor, that forces the paper down into the engraved, lacquer-filled lines and lifts an impression of the pattern straight off the plate. He peels the paper back off the plate carefully, and what comes away is, in a sense, upside down. The asphalt lacquer image now sitting on the paper is the negative of the pattern engraved into the plate. Everywhere the plate was cut deep, the paper picked up lacquer. Everywhere it was flat, the paper stayed clean. To speed the work along, since a printing plate is usually engraved with several identical copies of the same pattern side by side, Hermzat cuts the printed tissue paper into individual strips. Depending on the job, he can use those strips to cover every surface of a single blade or spread them across several different blades at once, whichever the order calls for. Each strip then gets laid directly onto the actual steel blade surface, the paper transferring its negative image onto the metal itself. Damascening blade surfaces this way is not a recent invention in Solingen. The practice has been documented here since the 17th century, and in its earliest form, patterns were painted or engraved directly onto the steel blades by hand, one at a time, with none of this printing plate intermediary step at all. That changed in the early 19th century when a Solingen factory worker named Abraham Schaberg developed the process still in use today. Engrave the pattern as a negative into a stone plate first, coat it in lacquer, then transfer that lacquer image onto the blade using tissue paper as the go-between. Exactly the sequence Hermsat is demonstrating here, more than a century and a half after Schaberg worked it out. Once the paper is peeled away from the blade itself, the pattern that remains on the steel is now the positive of the original engraving, the mirror image of the mirror image, restored to its right orientation, sitting in black lacquer directly on bare metal. With the design transferred, Hermsat covers every part of the blade surface that is not meant to be etched, everywhere outside the pattern, with a heavier coat of asphalt lacquer, sealing it against what comes next. This acid-resistant coating, known in the trade as the Zeugkund, isn't a modern industrial compound. It's mixed to a traditional recipe of beeswax, turpentine, and asphalt, the same basic formula damasceners have relied on for generations because it holds up reliably against acid without damaging the steel underneath it. The etching itself is done with nitric acid, but carefully and not by simple immersion. The blade is never dipped directly into the acid bath. Doing so risks the acid eventually working its way through even the sealed lacquer coating and etching areas it was never meant to touch. Instead, the acid is applied and controlled far more deliberately, protecting everything the lacquer has covered while it eats into the exposed pattern lines alone. Once the acid has done its work, the blade goes into a plain water bath to rinse everything clean and stop the etching process cold. In damascening's earliest days here, the work was done almost exclusively on blades. Old price lists from after 1900 show the trade broadening out considerably, though. Damasceners of that era were also decorating scissors, letter openers, cutlery, even tobacco tins, applying the exact same technique to whatever needed an ornamental finish. Today, roughly 20 damasceners are still working in Solingen at all, and most of their business now runs the other direction from where it started. Pocket knives and hunting knives make up the bulk of the work, with edged weapons like this one now the smaller, more specialized side of the trade. Before the blade can move on, the asphalt lacquer itself has to come off entirely. It's cleaned away in a gasoline bath, dissolving the coating without disturbing the etched steel beneath it, and then the blade is dried. Not with a cloth, but buried in sawdust, which draws out the last of the moisture and keeps the freshly bared metal from rusting before it reaches its next stage. In the galvanic department works Karl Mumenhof, 44, an electroplater by trade. His job is nickel plating the etched blades, coating the bare steel in a thin, even layer of nickel that protects it and gives it its final bright finish. The process starts simply enough, setting each blade into a frame, a galvanic rack, that will carry it through every bath in sequence without anyone having to handle the pieces individually along the way. The plant itself is relatively new, installed in 1991, and it runs the blades through 9 separate baths in order. First comes ultrasonic cleaning at 80 degrees Celsius, using sound vibration through the liquid to shake loose any residue clinging to the surface. Water rinse baths follow, washing that residue away completely. Then, an electrolytic anodic degreasing bath strips away the last traces of oil or grease, using an electrical current running through the solution to do chemically what a simple wash alone couldn't. Modern galvanic plants like this one run with automatic control systems monitoring both the current strength and the concentration of each solution continuously, adjusting as needed rather than leaving it to guesswork. Further along the line, the blades pass through a bath of diluted sulfuric acid, a pickling step that prepares the surface to actually accept the nickel coating that follows. Nickel plating, or galvanizing more broadly, simply means coating a metal surface with another metallic layer through an electrochemical process. Here, that happens in a nickel salt solution, with automatic mechanisms gently moving the rack back and forth the whole time to keep the coating building up evenly across every surface, rather than settling thicker in some spots than others. A final series of water rinse baths clears the blades of any remaining chemical residue. Electroplater is a genuine apprentice trade in Germany, straddling both craft and industry, with a standard 3-year training period behind it. Mumenhof himself didn't come up through that formal route. He was trained on the job, directly in the galvanic department of the blade factory where he still works today. Once dried, the nickel-plated blades are, in the strictest sense, finished. Every stage of work on the steel itself is complete. What remains is assembly, turning a finished blade into a complete weapon, and that work happens here at the Klingenfabrik Hörster. A complete edged weapon, by the trade's own definition, has exactly 3 parts: the blade, the mount, the montur, meaning the guard, grip, and pommel assembly as a unit, and the scabbard. The man who brings all 3 together is Herr Hufschmied, 50 years old, a sword fitter by trade, and it's his job to work the mount and fit the whole weapon together. The mount itself doesn't start in his workshop at all. It arrives already cast in rough form by specialist foundries working in a brass-copper alloy, and Hufschmied's first job is filing off the leftover casting residue and reworking the rough surface into something fit for a finished weapon. Where the mount carries decorative detail, a lion's head is a recurring motif on these pieces. He works it further with a hammer and a small punch, chasing individual strands of the lion's mane into the soft brass one careful strike at a time, building texture and depth that casting alone could never produce. After the fine work comes deburring, running the mount along a grinding belt to remove the sharp burr edges left over from filing and casting, smoothing every surface a hand would actually touch. The sword fitter's role has always run wider than the bench work alone. Historically, it was his job not just to smooth and polish the blade and mount the finished weapon, but to bring it to market himself, to actually sell what he'd built. It's no accident that many of Solingen's merchants and manufacturers trace their own origins straight back to the old sword fitters guild. The trade that assembled the weapons also, for a long stretch of the town's history, sold them. Before the mount can be plated, it still needs shaping, bending the guard, the curved metal bow that will protect the hand, along with the rest of the mount, into its final form by hand. From there, it goes back through the galvanic shop, on its own separate path from the blade, a degreasing bath, a water rinse, a bath in sulfuric acid, and finally the gold bath itself, tended by a worker in a light blue shirt who submerges the rack and gently agitates it, fine bubbles rising as the plating takes hold. Lifted out and rinsed, the parts come up a bright, unmistakable gold. In a last water bath, heated to around 90 degrees Celsius, the piece takes on its finished color, a warm, yellow-gold finish that will define how the whole weapon looks once assembled. Putting it all together, blade, mount, and scabbard into one finished weapon remains today exactly as it always has, the sword fitter's job. In Solingen, the trade still goes by an older name too, the Blankmacher, literally the one who makes it blank, bright, and finished. It is, in the end, one person's hands that turn separately made parts into something that can actually be worn, carried, or fought with. The Solingen sword is a trademark of genuine world renown, and the closing footage here makes the case in images rather than words, a rapid survey of just how many different lives one of these blades might go on to live. Field swords, officer swords, and full dress and ceremonial swords for the military, both here at home in Germany and in armies around the world. The archive holds a historic photograph captioned Das Heidegrab alongside a formal portrait of Prince and Princess Adalbert of Prussia, sword prominent between them. Fencing blades and dueling blades, Pauk and Mensur weapons, carried by student fraternities who have kept those traditions alive for generations. Their photographs showing rows of young men posing with the blades that marked their fraternity. Modern commissions carry the trade forward too. A sword etched for the Chilean Navy, Marina de Chile, and another inscribed with Arabic script for a customer further afield. A musketeer's sword, borrowed as an attribute in advertising imagery, trading on centuries of association. royal insignia and ceremonial weapons for the Solingen Hannekoper associations, a distinctly local folk tradition built around exactly this kind of blade, pictured in old photographs of men marching in formation and standing guard in ranks. A decorative centerpiece in the honoring of a marksman king and his consort at a shooting festival, a representative attribute of the Cologne Carnival, paraded each year by figures in traditional costume. One final photograph showing a costumed carnival figure posing proudly with his sword. And through all of it, one closing fact stands out. For all the blades that have gone out from Solingen to royal courts, armies, and carnival societies across the world, Solingen itself has always remained, first and foremost, the steadiest customer market for its own edged weapons. A town that has never stopped making these because it has never stopped wanting them.